Do you have a favorite Easter hymn? An old-time song that takes you back, maybe to Easter's long past with grandparents and family, singing at church about the death and the resurrection of Jesus and what that means for you. Maybe it's like we've sung, Christ the Lord is risen today, or He lives. If you're a Johnny Cash fan, maybe there's nothing like when he does that bass version of Were you there when they crucified my Lord? I like that one. Gaither aficionados probably go for Because He Lives, because that's something that comes from them. Well, here's a hint. If you're ever asked that question about what's your favorite Easter song, Easter hymn, don't ever answer in the garden. Just don't do it, because as beautiful a song as it is, with its description of a time spent with Jesus in prayer and in fellowship, something that's so special that, as it says, none other has ever known, whatever garden it's speaking of is not the Garden of Gethsemane, okay? That's a beautiful place with roses, it says, and birds that can't even compete with Jesus' voice. The Garden of Gethsemane for Jesus was a difficult time, and we're going to be looking at those moments that Jesus spent there, those hours before His arrest, His trial, and His crucifixion. We're going to be looking at the accounts of two of the Gospels this morning, and for some background, we'll start out in Luke chapter 22. And as we continue, though, our study we've been working on for the past month or so is we've been looking at conversations with Jesus that John tells us about in the gospel that bears his name. And so we'll be looking at the Gospel of John, chapter 18, very closely in a few moments. But let me set the stage for you this morning. The Lord and His disciples had just shared the evening together in a borrowed banqueting room. They've shared the Passover meal together, the annual remembrance and celebration of God's great work of deliverance that brought their ancestors out of slavery in Egypt. But from first to last that night, Jesus had transformed the symbolism that prescribed for the meal. And instead of looking back at what God had done in the days of Moses, delivering out of slavery in Egypt 1,400, 1,500 years before, Jesus turned it all on its head. He took the traditional unleavened bread and wine, and He applied them to His own body, His own blood. And as John especially makes clear, Jesus also did a lot of teaching that night. It was the last opportunity before His arrest, His crucifixion, to spend time with them. But as they left the table at the end of that evening, they returned to their usual camping spot outside the city, across the Kidron Valley. And Luke's account paints the scene for us. We're in Luke 22, beginning in verse 39. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and His disciples followed Him. On reaching the place, He said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down, and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Well, here we see the location where Jesus knelt and prayed. He's on the Mount of Olives. It's across the Kidron Valley from the walls of Jerusalem itself. We see Jesus has given His disciples an assignment, and He tells them why. He says, pray, but pray for this particular thing, that you will not fall into temptation. You'll not give up what you've invested the last 3 years in, that you'll not turn away from me in this most difficult of times. And in that passage, and the reason I wanted to look at Luke for a moment, we get a glimpse into Jesus' mental and spiritual state at that moment. You can read all through all 4 Gospels, and you never find him like this. He's in anguish. It's to the point that the Father dispatches one of his special angels to encourage the Son. He prays for relief, and yet he says, whatever your will is, Father, that is what I'm going to do. And this went on for a while, as Mark makes clear in his gospel. He tells us that Jesus went away and prayed. He went back to the disciples, found them asleep, woke them up, went back and prayed, went back to the disciples, found them asleep again, went back and prayed yet again, came back and they're asleep again. So this is stretched out for quite some time, this time that Jesus has prayed so earnestly. And with that account in mind, we're ready to read John's recounting of what went on next. John chapter 18, beginning in verse 1. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. So that's just exactly what we read in Luke a few moments ago. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," he said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers, with its commander and the Jewish officials, arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. The prayer John mentions at the first there, when he had finished praying, that's the last thing that had been said in the upper room. We read it in John chapter 17. You might have heard it referred to as the high priestly prayer of Jesus, as he prayed not only for his disciples around him, but he prayed for you and he prayed for me that night. So John is saying they left that place after that prayer. They journeyed across the Kidron Valley, just like we said, and now they have ended up across the way in this garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. You can see why we looked at the accounts of Luke and just mentioned a little bit about that of Mark. Because otherwise we wouldn't know about all the time that Jesus spent in anguish and in prayer. Suddenly the quiet is broken with the glare of torches, the clinking sounds of swords and chains swinging against the hips of soldiers. And Mark tells us Jesus' words to his disciples as he woke them up that last time. "Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." And so we come to the meat of the conversation that's here. What we're looking at this morning, both as he talked with this little detachment of soldiers and others who had come to arrest him, and with his own star disciple, Peter. And not only that, we'll stop right at the end and we'll note what he did rather than what he said that made a difference in the life of one of these men, maybe an eternal difference. The first thing we see is the soldiers followed Judas into the olive groves of Gethsemane. John tells us that Jesus went out to meet them. He was bold, and yet he was submitted to the Father's will. In that hour, he stood in the garden as he stands today, our fearless Redeemer. Who is it you want? And when they said Jesus of Nazareth, he said, I am he. Literally, I am. It's the same phrase that had gotten him in trouble many times, because he would say things and that made those who were biblically literate, they'd go, oh, he's putting himself on the same plane as God. That's crazy talk. That's heresy. I am. This is a moment of cosmic significance. It would be hours before his hands and feet were nailed to a Roman cross. But here in the early morning hours in the garden, Jesus made the good confession. The confession that would lead to that tragic hour. I am he. What he is he talking about? Take your pick. Take your pick. But I tend to think he had Isaiah 53 on his mind at that moment. Let me read just a few verses from there. Isaiah 53, 4 through 6. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. In Jesus' bold acknowledgement, I am the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. I am the suffering servant that Isaiah promised hundreds of years ago would come and would take up the sins of the people. It was, as I said a moment ago, a moment of cosmic significance. And if we doubt that, we see a little bit of movie special effects right here. You got to wonder, did this time-space continuum get sort of whacked or warped or something at the moment? What knocked those soldiers to the ground? Boom! I am. And there is no other. It's worth remembering that what preceded this bold moment of Jesus' confidence as he stood there and he looked him in the eye was the hours of anguished prayer beforehand. He prayed, he wept. An angel strengthened him. And then he stood and said, I am. If you wonder why you often fail at those moments, you mean to stand. Maybe it's because you don't put in that little time of prayer before you face them. Think about that. But the conversation isn't over. We read next that, as always, Jesus was concerned for his followers. Even in his great hour of struggle, he revealed himself to be a tireless intercessor for them. What's an intercessor? That's a person who steps in and steps before on behalf of someone else and says, let me speak a word. Let me help. We need an intercessor like that. Jesus said, if you're looking for me, then let these men go, in verse 8. In verse 9, it tells us that this fulfilled his own words, that I have not lost one of those you gave me, Father. You might dismiss that concern as irrelevant to you today. You might say, man, that's almost 2,000 years ago. What does that have to do with me? I think Jesus would beg to differ. Let me give you a couple of verses that suggest it. Romans 8:34 tells us that to this very day, Christ Jesus is at the right hand of God, and he is also interceding for who? Us. Hebrews 7:25 gives us this great promise. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. For who? Those who come to Him, who come to God through Him. That's you, my friend. If you belong to Jesus, He's interceding for you even now, and He always will. But we need to note a couple more things about this passage before we close this morning. The next thing we see is that Jesus is a patient teacher. And I don't know about you, but I'm so glad for that. He's a patient teacher who is always enlightening and correcting and sometimes cleaning up after His followers. Let me show you what I mean. Jesus had only hours earlier given the apostles the advice and permission. It would be a good idea now to go on and buy a sword for protection. And you know He wasn't surprised when they go, oh, well, we happen to have a couple of them right here. Right? He knew it. He knew it. But here in this moment, when Peter pulled out one of those two swords and he whacked the head of a fellow named Malchus and cut off his ear, Jesus let him know right away, this is not the time, that's not the way. Put away your sword. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? You know, the trouble with swords and things like that, it's like the old proverb that says, to a man who has a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Have you ever heard that? In other words, the way to deal with every problem is just whack the tar out of it. Peter gave Malchus a good whack, and Jesus said, not right now, not here, not you. In fact, when you read the New Testament, I dare you to say much of any time, other than when your life is in danger, that it's appropriate. Jesus left Peter and the others, and I dare say us too, with a more nuanced view on this subject than we might prefer. Our swords, our angry words, our fists, our firearms, they may have a place in this violent world, but it is not the first place. It's not the primary place. The first thing we ought to do as followers of Jesus. We must remember, the people of God, the redeemed of the ages. Our primary weapons are spiritual, not physical. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 10:4 that with these spiritual weapons we have the power to demolish the strongholds of the devil himself in our hearts, in our minds, in our culture at large. That being the case, I believe that more often than not, the Lord's advice to us, His command to us, is going to be put away the sword, not draw it. We must trust our teacher's guidance in moments like that. There's one more thing that Jesus speaks to us in this conversation, and He speaks it without using any words. All four Gospels tell us about the sword. They tell us about the servant and his right ear that is separated from the rest of his body. John here tells us the man's name, Malchus. And Luke contributes another nugget of information about what went on that night. I'm going to look again at Luke chapter 22, this time beginning in verse 49. When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. Notice they didn't wait for an answer. But Jesus answered, no more of this. And He touched the man's ear and healed him. We put all this together, and we find that Jesus is a merciful healer. This is His last miraculous healing. And notice who it's performed upon. A man who actively intended his harm, his death. In all that was going on there that night, and all the craziness in the dark, Jesus touched Malchus' ear and healed him. So why did John give us the fellow's name? The Gospel of John is the last of the 4 Gospels that was written. It's decades after the days of Jesus walking the earth. I believe it's likely that Malchus, moved by the miracle he experienced that night, and then later touched by the gospel, had given his heart to Jesus. He was known to the church. He was part of the church. And his story was one that he would tell over and over and over again through the years. The confusion, the struggle, the burning sensation as his ear was separated from his body. And then Jesus somehow finding him in the moonlight, touching him without a word before being bound and led away. The Passion of the Christ sets the stage for this in the way it depicts the scene. I sat and watched that again for the first time in several years the other night. And there is the darkness that's lit by the moon only, and there's a fog, it's hard to see. There's confusion. Suddenly Peter jumps into action. He pulls that short sword and he starts to swing it, and Malchus falls to his knees. He clutches his ear. Blood's pouring out. And then while the others subdue, so to speak, Peter, Jesus finds Malchus. And you see him reach and he picks up his ear. And he holds it to his head. And suddenly the look on Malchus' face changes. The soldiers grab Jesus. They put him in chains. They drag him away while all the disciples flee. And soon the scene is of only one man that's still there. Malchus on his knees, his hand held to his ear, wondering what has just happened to him. You can see the wheels turn in his head as he kneels there. What's just happened? How in the world? Why me? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. We're all like Malchus in our own ways, you know. Maybe we're not actively attacking Jesus, but we go along with the crowd that mocks him and turns their back on him and his people. Maybe, like Malchus, you've even been wounded by the words or the actions of a well-meaning Christian. You aren't the first. And sadly, you won't be the last. But I urge you, don't let their actions keep you from what you and I and all of us really need. The healing of our souls. That's the love of God that is in Jesus. 1 John 4:7 and following says, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we ought also to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. It was evident to the last as Jesus was dragged away, taken to that kangaroo court that would sentence him to crucifixion. It was evident in those early hours of that Sunday morning as God dispatched an angel to say, He's not here, He's risen. God's love is evident today. The tomb is still empty. Lives have been transformed. In Him, in Jesus, is a hope and a future like no other.